Yo, welcome back. James here, and this is animation for video games. In this tutorial, we're going to be going through the next phase in the animation set series, which will include the idle pose, the idle animation, and basically everything leading up to that, which is quite a lot actually. So, yeah, let's get straight into it. Alright, here we go. So, we have our character, it's been given to us. Um, and we need to create some animations. So the first thing we need to do is create an idle pose. Why an idle pose? Um, well, in a video game, the most important animations for any character um, are the idle pose, the run cycle, and to a lesser extent the walk cycle, because you will see these animations the most of any animation. You'll probably see the combat as well quite a lot, but where we establish the way the character behaves, the way the character moves, the speed. It's kind of all done with like the basics, right? The run cycle, the idle. So it's important to get these right. Um, for the most part, concept artists and designers have come up with a general idea of what they want. Um, but the animators usually have a lot of you know contribution that we can make, especially in previous stages before the game actually starts production. So, what am I going to do for this? What am I going to do for this character in terms of idle pose? The first thing I am going to do is think about the game. The game needs, what the game wants from the character. Um, so let's have a quick look at that. Here we have. So what I mean by the game needs is, what kind of style of game is it? Is it a realistic kind of serious game? Is it a cartoony and kind of fun, silly kind of game? What type of game is it? Is it an action game, RPG, fighting, etc.? All of this kind of stuff affects the way the character should look and behave, and especially when it comes to an idle pose, how is the character displayed? Is it a 2D game? So is it side on? Is the character far away? Is it isometric? This affects how the silhouette will look, how kind of big the pose, like how exaggerated we want to make the idle pose. Is it first person? So are we even going to see the pose, or are we just going to see hands? Um, we want to know the kind of the general speed of the way the character is going to move in the game, the way the game works, how fast the game works. You know, again, blending goes back into the style of the game. Is it realistic? Is it going to need a lot of smooth kind of animation, or is everything just going to be um, quite exaggerated, I guess, and not need much blending? So once I've kind of established this stuff, and in my case, I'm thinking that it's going to be a quite natural looking game, but with a little bit of exaggeration. So it's not going to be super realistic, but it's not going to be slapstick. It's kind of going to be somewhere in the middle. The type of game is going to be an action brawler game. In my case, I think. How is the character displayed? It's going to be third person. The camera is going to be behind the character, and she's going to run around and fight. Speed animation, how much blending? It's going to be fairly simple. It's an action game, so it's going to need to be fairly responsive, and so the blending will make it look nice, but it's not going to be there's not going to be too much. It's not going to be overly animated. So with all that in mind, I can start to come up with an idea of what my character is going to be like. Now, if we look at Maya, This is the character I have. And so I need to give her an attitude and a personality. Um, I chose this character because I wanted something a little bit more unique than just the kind of standard human character that I used in previous tutorials. I thought it might add a little bit of uniqueness to the animations as well. So obviously the body shape is different, which means the weight is different, and that will affect the animation. But what I want to do is, even though she is, well, let's go to Sketchbook Pro. Character needs. So based on the gameplay needs that we spoke about before, we can start coming up with the character needs. So it's going to be an action game, so she's going to need to be quite agile. Her personality is going to be quite, quite up for it, quite like into the fight. So she's going to be quite kind of like upbeat, ready to fight. She's not going to be like overly aggressive. I think she's going to quite enjoy fighting. Enjoy fighting. But be quite positive. Not like aggressive and angry and emo. Yeah. What else? What kind of fighting is she gonna use? What kind of style? How is she gonna move around? I think she's gonna be quite not like street fighting. Not street fighting. So she's gonna have a little bit of like actual technique. And maybe she'll be a bit of a show off. So from this we can like, the poses we're gonna need to use are gonna be quite bold, poses. You know, with actual technique to them. So like to actual martial arts. Yeah, generally that's it. I think we're starting to get a good idea of the character. And from here, we could start going straight into Maya and start posing, and trying different things out. But what I like to do is I like to make sketches. So for this tutorial, I like to sketch a bunch of stuff, because for me, sketching isn't necessarily something that I use to copy onto the character, but I use it kind of as a thought process. So in this case, I did a lot of sketches for the way that I wanted the character to look. Maybe a bit more like self-confident and powerful. Just thought maybe like exploring the way that she'd hold herself. This is before I came up with the kind of like bigger rig. But then I started to get into a bit more like martial arty poses, and then I started thinking about sumo wrestling, because she's a bit bigger, but I thought, nah, it's a bit too much and it's a bit more cliched. So maybe just like regular wrestling. She's a bit more like poised, a bit more posed, kind of ready, a little bit lower stance, kind of an action stance. She's always moving around, so she's always ready. She's not kind of like always upright. So I started kind of going down that kind of path, and I was kind of starting to get happy with this shape, this kind of shape. I'm thinking something along those lines. So from here, I would then definitely start to pose out in Maya, which is what I'm going to start doing right now. Right, so what I thought I would do is create a bunch of different poses, different possible idle poses, and talk about kind of what makes a good pose. Remember, we're not talking about the idle animation just yet, we're just talking about the pose. So what makes a good idle pose? Well, first of all, you gotta think about the player. You gotta think about the fact that, yeah, it's an idle pose, but it transitions into a walk or a run or a jump or whatever. And so you've got to think about, first of all, the foot placement. If you have a character like this, actually let's go through the poses first. So I've got this one, she's very relaxed. It's not a bad pose. It could work for an idle pose. It could work in maybe an RPG game, or it could work in an action game. We've got this pose, which is more of a fighting pose. It definitely work best in a 2D game. Side on kind of pose, you get a nice silhouette here. Less of a good silhouette from the behind. You got this pose, which is very low. Her legs are very far apart. It's not bad. It's symmetrical. She's got an upright pose. Again, very symmetrical. Legs quite far apart again. Would work better from behind than from the side, definitely. And you've got kind of the pose that I more or less decided on. But yeah, what do we want from an idle pose? We want a pose that can transition into a walk and a run and a jump very easily. So if you have a pose like this one, where the legs are very far apart, you really got to think about how it's going to transition. Not only into a run, I guess you can kind of see how it might transition into a run. She could kind of adjust herself a little bit and kind of like, sprint off. But imagine if she had finished running and then it's got to blend back into this pose somehow. That would be really difficult, I think. It's quite action-packed. It's quite a strong pose, but I don't think it'd work very well as an idle pose. This, on the other hand, is kind of the other side, where it's very relaxed. And for a slow-paced game, that would work really well. But if you're running around all the time, if it's a fast-paced game, transitioning back into this pose would probably take quite a while. I mean, it could work. I've seen games that do it. You've also got the foot placement, which is not bad. But if the feet are dead side on, again, you've got to think about how that transition in and out of walking and running. Like, there's a bit more adjustment that needs to be done before you get into this pose, or if you get into a running pose or walking pose or back into this pose. So from here, she'd have to kind of like shift her weight to over to here a bit, and then start walking, if you know what I mean. Which would just make things a bit more laborious. And in an action game, we want things to be quite responsive and quite quick. So you can start to see how the idle pose is actually pretty important. in the way that we think about how it's going to look, based on how it's going to transition in and out of the idle pose. So, oh, and this one again, because of the way the feet are, transitioning into a walk or run from this point would be quite difficult. But if it's a 2D game, usually they kind of shuffle along a little bit. It'd be easier to fake if the camera was locked to 2D. So, bearing all that in mind, I kind of settled on this pose. And we have a camera which is kind of going to be around here. So what I did was I made the silhouette non-symmetrical. You can get a good idea of what's happening. She's crouched over, but not too much that you don't see. You know, if it was like that, it'd be really, the silhouette wouldn't be quite so good. She's in a ready pose because she's agile. She's not relaxed. She's always going to be moving around. She's not, she's not chilled out. She's going to be quite action-packed. So she's ready to move. Her legs are in a position where she can easily transition out of this pose into a run or a walk. Her head's facing forward. And generally, like I said, it's a non-symmetrical pose. It doesn't look... It looks good from most angles. It's relaxed enough, the legs aren't too far apart, but it's not too relaxed. It's a nice kind of like midway through something. And I think that works quite well. And what I kind of decided was that her kind of style would be wrestling, along those lines of wrestling, but a bit more kind of a little bit more exaggerated, a little bit more energy, maybe like Mexican wrestling, which is a bit more agile than regular wrestling, a little bit more show-offy, a bit more cartoony maybe. So I think this works. I think it's going to work quite well as an idle pose. And from here, now that I've got a decent idle pose, and bear in mind, once we start animating stuff, the idle pose can, and in most cases does, change at least a little bit, just to make sure that everything again transitions in and out pretty smoothly. But for now I'm pretty happy with this, and I can move on to start creating the actual idle animation, which is what I'm going to do right now. Okay, so now we have an idle pose. It's the next step is to animate it, and I've put an idle animation onto the pose. There isn't a whole lot to say about idle animations. Like I think I mentioned in the previous video, there's multiple idle animations usually for a character. There's this one, which is going to be the one you see the majority of the time, where they're just kind of breathing and they're ready. And you'll have other ones where they actually break out of this into some sort of action, scratching their head, for example, or looking around, or getting impatient. And I'd say the most important thing to think about when doing these kind of animations is to, especially this one, is to make sure it doesn't look weird after a couple of loops. So make it look natural, make it look simple. Don't make it look mechanical. Make sure that it doesn't draw too much attention to itself. It has to look natural, really. My personal preference is not to go too overboard on your overlap, because I see that all the time with idle animations, where they make the breathing look really overly animated, and the arm swings or the finger overlap. They just kind of go a bit crazy with it. And of course, it depend on the kind of game that you're working on. If it's a really cartoony game, you can get away with that a little bit more. But generally, I like to keep things subtle and natural looking. So yeah, here we've got this animation, and she's looking ready. She's looking ready to do something, move. She's a very actiony kind of character, so she's not going to be too chilled out. She's looking to react or to do something herself. And yeah. Yeah, I think there's not too much more to say about that. So, in this lesson, we went through the stages of kind of thinking about your character's personality and its behavior, its attitude, which which is affected by the game needs, the things that you need to think about, that the game wants, and from that you can kind of base your ideas on that, and from that you can start posing your character, start thinking about what makes a good idle pose, and then once that's done, you create an animation based on it. And here we have it. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. In the next one, we're going to go through the locomotion, so probably the run cycle, maybe the walk as well. So look forward to that. But for now, goodbye.